My fiancé slept with my maid of honor for 8 months, bought her an $8,000 bracelet from our wedding fund, and let her call our wedding a fuck-ass joke. When I confronted him, he stammered, "We can talk about this privately." I stayed silent. That was 10 months ago. Yesterday, his new girlfriend messaged me, asking if the wedding video was real. An hour later, his status changed to single. How did you ruin your own wedding? I was helping my fiancé recover his hacked Instagram account 3 weeks before our wedding when I found the messages that changed everything. Julian had been freaking out because someone changed his password and he needed to get back in to approve the wedding hashtag post his groomsmen wanted to share, and he's useless with technology. I was sitting on our couch with his laptop, going through his email to find the recovery link, when I noticed he had another Instagram account logged in on his browser that I didn't recognize. The username was just random numbers and letters, but when I clicked on it, my entire world crumbled into pieces. There were hundreds of messages between this account and my maid of honor, Nina, going back 8 months. The messages started flirty, but got progressively more explicit, with photos I never wanted to see of my best friend since middle school. The most recent message from her, sent just that morning while we were at our final dress fitting together, said, "I can't wait until this fuck-ass joke of a wedding's over so we'll have more time together." My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the laptop, and I felt like I was going to throw up right there on our couch. Julian was in the kitchen asking if I'd found the recovery email yet, completely oblivious that I'd just discovered his affair with my best friend. I told Julian I needed to run to the store and drove straight to my bridesmaid's apartment, ugly crying the whole way. She took one look at my face and called an emergency meeting with the other 3 bridesmaids, and within an hour, we were all crowded in her living room plotting revenge that would destroy them both. One bridesmaid's sister was a graphic designer who offered to make a slideshow, another knew a private investigator, and the third had a boyfriend with a friend who worked at the hotel where Nina had been meeting Julian every Tuesday when she told me she had Pilates class. The private investigator was worth every penny because he found credit card records showing Julian had bought Nina a Cartier bracelet with our joint wedding savings account, the same account I'd been putting half my paycheck into for 2 years while eating ramen to save money. The hotel had security footage of them making out in the lobby that my bridesmaid's boyfriend's friend managed to copy, and the timestamp showed it was during my birthday dinner when Julian claimed he had food poisoning. Another bridesmaid reached out to our wedding DJ, who happened to be her ex still desperately trying to win her back, and he practically begged to help cue up our slideshow on the projector during the ceremony. The photographer was immediately on board after I showed her messages where Nina called her work mediocre at best, and told Julian I was too stupid to know good photography. Even the venue coordinator got involved when she saw Nina had been trying to change my menu selections behind my back, telling Julian my taste in food was embarrassingly suburban. But the most satisfying ally came when Julian's mom called me after my bridesmaid's mom let something slip at book club. His mother drove 2 hours to meet me at a coffee shop where I showed her everything, and I watched this elegant woman slam her hand on the table and say, "That pathetic little worm is not going to humiliate the girl who was supposed to be my future daughter-in-law at her own wedding. And if he thinks he's getting a dime of inheritance after this, he's even dumber than I thought." She called Julian's dad and brother, who both agreed to block the exits during the ceremony, and his brother actually thanked me for finally giving him a reason to punch Julian in his smug face. The plan was perfect and absolutely devastating. We would let the ceremony proceed normally through Nina's maid of honor speech, where she'd talk about loyalty and friendship, while standing next to me in the dress I'd bought for her, because I wanted her to feel beautiful at my wedding. Then when the officiant asked if anyone objected, I would stand there in my beautiful dress that cost more than 3 months of rent, holding my bouquet of white roses that Nina helped me pick while secretly texting my fiancé, and destroy both of them in front of everyone they knew. The wedding day arrived and everything started exactly as planned, with Nina completely oblivious, and Julian nervously sweating through his suit like the guilty rat he was. Nina gave her speech about how she'd been there for every milestone and would always protect me from anyone who tried to hurt me, while Julian's mom visibly clenched her jaw from the front row, and his brother cracked his knuckles. The officiant finally got to the part everyone was waiting for, and asked if anyone had any reason why we shouldn't be married. My hand found the remote we'd hidden in my flowers, and the projector screen started descending behind the altar exactly as rehearsed. I took a breath and said the words that would change everything. "Actually, Father, I have something to say about that." The screen behind the altar lit up with everything, and the whole church went dead silent as the first image appeared showing Julian and Nina kissing in our bedroom. I walked down the aisle toward the parking lot while behind me the church exploded into chaos with people gasping and shouting, and Julian's voice cracking as he tried to explain. My legs felt like jelly, but I kept walking straight through the heavy wooden doors into the bright sunlight, where Tara caught up with me and wrapped her arms around me so tight I could barely breathe. "You did it. You actually did it." She kept saying it over and over while guests started pouring out of the church with their phones already recording everything. My whole body was shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off, but I'd never felt more free in my entire life. 2 hours later, I was at the reception venue sitting at the head table with 3 champagnes already down and working on my 4th, when the venue coordinator rushed over with this huge grin on her face. She leaned in close and told me the hotel had just called because Julian and Nina were trying to check in with their reservation, but all their credit cards kept getting declined. Margaret appeared at my elbow with her own champagne glass raised high and this look of pure satisfaction on her face. She told me she'd had her banker freeze all of Julian's accounts an hour ago and asked if the apartment lease was in my name only. When I nodded, she smiled even wider and said good, because he could find somewhere else to live now. Becca showed up with a plate of salmon and vegetables, and pushed it in front of me saying I needed to eat something. While I picked at the fish, she pulled out her phone and showed me how the video of the ceremony was already blowing up on TikTok with over 500 shares in just 2 hours. People were commenting things like queen behavior and this is how you handle cheaters, and someone had already made it into a meme with dramatic music. The reception turned into this weird celebration where everyone kept buying me drinks and telling me how brave I was, while Julian's family members kept coming up to apologize for his behavior. His cousin told me she'd always known he was trash, and his aunt slipped me an envelope with $5,000 in cash saying it was the least she could do. The DJ played Before He Cheats, and the whole room sang along while I stood on a chair waving my bouquet like a victory flag. The next morning, I woke up in my apartment still wearing my wedding dress with mascara all over my pillow and my phone buzzing nonstop on the nightstand. There were 247 missed calls from Julian and 89 from Nina, plus hundreds of texts I didn't even want to read. I blocked both their numbers with one swipe, then ordered pancakes and bacon from my favorite breakfast place and had them deliver it right to my door. While I sat there eating pancakes in my wrinkled wedding dress, I looked around the apartment at all of Julian's stuff still sitting there like nothing had happened. His gaming setup took up half the living room, and his closet was full of designer clothes he'd bought with my money, and his stupid guitar collection covered an entire wall. I texted Becca asking if she wanted to help me redecorate, and she responded immediately with 20 exclamation points and a bunch of fire emojis. We spent the rest of the day boxing up his crap and taking pictures of me throwing his stuff into garbage bags while still wearing my wedding dress because why not? 3 days later, the moving company I'd hired showed up with a huge truck and started loading all of Julian's belongings while I supervised from the couch drinking coffee in my pajamas. Julian showed up halfway through with a police officer claiming I was stealing his property and demanding they stop loading the truck immediately. I calmly showed the officer the lease with only my name on it, plus all the receipts proving I'd paid for literally everything in the apartment, including his precious gaming computer. The officer looked at the paperwork, then looked at Julian, and told him there was nothing he could do since everything legally belonged to me. Julian completely lost it and started screaming that I was a vindictive bitch and that I'd ruined his life while the movers just kept loading boxes into the truck. The officer warned him to calm down or he'd be arrested for disturbing the peace, but Julian kept yelling and calling me every name in the book. I stood up from the couch and walked over to him and said, actually, he'd ruined his own life, and I just made sure everyone knew about it. His face turned purple and he tried to lunge at me, but the officer grabbed him and told him to leave immediately or he'd be going to jail. That evening, while I was eating Chinese takeout and watching Netflix, my work supervisor called and said she'd seen the video like everyone else in Minneapolis. She told me to take the rest of the week off with full pay, and when I came back, we needed to discuss the promotion I'd applied for because she liked employees who could execute a plan. I nearly choked on my lo mein when she said she was fast-tracking my application, and the raise would be retroactive to this month. A week after the wedding that wasn't Nina's Pilates studio posted a statement on their Instagram, saying she was taking a leave of absence to focus on personal matters. Mia immediately texted me screenshots of their Yelp page where people were leaving one-star reviews calling for Nina to be fired for being a homewrecker. Someone had even posted the ceremony video in the reviews with the caption, "This is your instructor's idea of integrity," and it already had hundreds of likes. The owner of the studio called me personally to apologize and said Nina would not be returning to teach there ever again. My phone kept blowing up with messages from numbers I didn't recognize, and it turned out reporters wanted to interview me about the viral wedding video that now had over 2 million views. I ignored them all and focused on turning Julian's former gaming room into my new home office with the money his aunt had given me. The next morning, Becca called to say she'd found a therapist who specialized in betrayal trauma and could see me that afternoon. I drove to the therapist's office in downtown Minneapolis and sat in the waiting room staring at a painting of a peaceful lake while my stomach churned. The therapist was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes who listened as I told her everything about the wedding and what led up to it. She nodded when I said I didn't regret exposing them and helped me understand that revenge could feel good, but healing would take longer. 3 days later, I got a certified letter from Julian's lawyer demanding half the wedding deposits back, which made me laugh out loud in my kitchen. Margaret had already connected me with her friend who was a divorce lawyer even though we'd never actually gotten married. And when I showed him the demand letter at his law office downtown, he actually snorted. He said Julian wanted money back from the wedding where he got exposed as a cheater, and suggested we countersue for emotional distress instead. 2 weeks after the wedding, Becca came over with wine and helped me go through all the photo albums from my 8 years with Julian. I thought I'd cry, but I felt nothing as I looked at pictures of us on vacations and holidays and birthdays. We built a fire in her backyard fire pit and burned every single photo while drinking the whole bottle of wine and roasting marshmallows over the flames. The next morning, someone knocked on my apartment door, and when I looked through the peephole, I saw Nina standing there looking terrible with dark circles under her eyes and unwashed hair. I kept the chain on the door when I opened it, and she immediately started begging me to talk. I told her we had nothing to discuss, and that she chose him over 13 years of friendship and could live with it. She started sobbing right there in my hallway and said she was pregnant, which made my stomach drop, even though I kept my face neutral. I told her congratulations and that Julian always said he didn't want kids, so good luck with that before closing the door in her face. A week later, my credit card company called about suspicious charges and asked if I'd been trying to buy $5,000 worth of electronics in Miami. The purchases matched exactly what Julian would buy: expensive gaming equipment and a new laptop, and the representative said someone had been trying to use my information at multiple stores. The fraud investigator called me back an hour later and said whoever did this had my social security number and my mother's maiden name, which meant they could open new accounts in my name. My hands were shaking as I realized Julian must have gotten all that information during our years together and was now desperate enough to commit identity theft. She said we needed to file a police report immediately to protect my credit and stop him from doing more damage. At the police station, the detective who took my report recognized me from the viral wedding video that was still going around social media. She said my ex seemed to be escalating and assigned a case number while suggesting I check all my bank accounts and change every password I had. And that night I couldn't sleep because every little sound in my apartment made me jump, and I kept thinking about how Julian knew where I hid my spare key and all my daily routines. At 3 a.m, I called Becca crying and asked if I could stay with her for a while because I didn't feel safe anymore. She came to pick me up right away, and the next morning over coffee at her apartment, we went through everything to make me safer. We changed all my passwords and ordered new locks for my apartment door, and Becca's boyfriend, who worked in cybersecurity, helped us set up security cameras. He found evidence that Julian had been trying to access my email account from different IP addresses and had attempted to reset my banking passwords multiple times. The next morning, Margaret called while I was making coffee, and her voice was shaking so bad I could barely understand her at first. She told me Julian had gone to his dad's bank and somehow convinced them he had permission to empty the boat fund account with $30,000 in cash that his father had been saving for 20 years. His dad was at the police station right now filing charges for theft and fraud, but Julian had already disappeared and nobody knew where he went. My stomach dropped because $30,000 in cash meant he could do almost anything without leaving a trail, and I started checking all my accounts again while Margaret kept talking about how she'd never seen her husband so angry. I spent the rest of the day installing extra locks on my windows and calling my bank to put fraud alerts on everything, while Becca sat with me going through Julian's old social media looking for places he might hide. 3 weeks passed with no sign of him, but I kept jumping at every noise and checking my rearview mirror constantly on my way to work. Then one morning I was scrolling through Instagram during my lunch break when Nina's face popped up on my feed even though I'd blocked her months ago. Someone had screenshot her post and it was going viral with thousands of comments because she'd announced she lost the baby with this long dramatic post about grief and loss. The comments were brutal, with people calling it karma and saying she didn't deserve to be a mother after what she did at my wedding. And even though part of me felt bad seeing her pain, I remembered how she'd smiled at me during dress fittings while texting my fiancé. 2 days later, I was in the middle of a client presentation when my boss's assistant knocked on the conference room door and said HR needed to see me immediately. My hands started sweating as I walked to the HR director's office, where she sat me down and explained someone had sent an anonymous tip claiming I'd been embezzling company funds and submitting fake expense reports. I knew right away it was Julian trying to destroy my career the same way I destroyed his, but I stayed calm and gave them access to all my records and receipts. The investigation took 4 days with forensic accountants going through 2 years of my expenses, but they found nothing because there was nothing to find, and my record was completely clean. The stress was killing me though, and I'd lost 12 pounds in 2 weeks because I couldn't eat and I wasn't sleeping more than 3 hours a night. Tara noticed I was falling apart and basically dragged me to her kickboxing gym one evening, saying I needed to do something physical to work through the anger. I stood there hitting the heavy bag over and over, picturing Julian's face with each punch. But halfway through the class, I realized I wasn't just angry anymore. I was scared of what he might do next. The next week passed in a blur of work and constantly looking over my shoulder until Tuesday afternoon, when a process server walked right up to my desk in front of all my coworkers and handed me legal papers. Nina was suing me for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, claiming the wedding video going viral had cost her job and caused her miscarriage, and she wanted $200,000 in damages. I called the lawyer my company recommended and met with him that afternoon, where he read through the lawsuit and actually started laughing. No. He explained she was representing herself, which was desperate and stupid, and we could countersue for alienation of affection, since Minnesota still recognized it, and she'd pursued an engaged man. We filed our response within a week, but then at the preliminary hearing, Nina walked in looking perfect in a designer suit with one of the most expensive lawyers in Minneapolis beside her. We both knew exactly who was paying for that lawyer, and my attorney leaned over and whispered that this just got interesting. During the recess, I went to the bathroom and Nina followed me in, waiting until we were alone before cornering me by the sinks. She looked terrible up close with dark circles under her makeup, and her hands shaking as she said Julian promised to take care of her if she helped destroy me in court. I pulled out my phone and started recording as I told her she needed help, and that Julian was using her again just like before. She started crying and ran out, but I had the whole conversation recorded, including her admission about Julian's plan. The hearing went badly for Nina when the judge saw our evidence and scheduled a full trial for 3 months later. 2 weeks after that, my boss called me into his office and I thought something was wrong, but instead he offered me a promotion to senior marketing director, with a 40% raise. He said anyone who could plan and execute something as complex as what I did at my wedding could definitely handle their product launches, and the board had unanimously approved my promotion. I was walking back to my desk with coffee when my phone rang, and the private investigator's number showed up on the screen. He told me Julian Morrison wasn't even his real name, and that he'd legally changed it from Julian Petrosky 5 years ago after sealing some juvenile records that he was still trying to access. My coffee went cold while he explained how Julian's ex-fiancée from college had filed a restraining order against him for draining her bank accounts and stalking her after she broke up with him, which sounded exactly like what was happening to me now. I found the ex-fiancée Emma on Facebook that night and sent her a message explaining who I was, and within an hour she'd agreed to a video call. Emma's face was tired when she appeared on my laptop screen, and she told me Julian had seemed perfect at first, but by the end she was scared for her life, and that I was brave for exposing him publicly, instead of just running like she did. Over the next few days, Emma sent me boxes of documentation through email showing forged checks with her signature, stolen credit card statements, printed harassment messages, and police reports that painted a clear pattern of someone who'd done this before and would do it again. But the weight of knowing I wasn't his first victim but also wouldn't be his last made me schedule an emergency session with my therapist 10 weeks after the wedding disaster. My therapist's office had the same beige walls, and that weird abstract painting I'd been staring at for months. But this time, I sat there holding printed copies of Emma's evidence, while she helped me understand that I wasn't responsible for Julian's patterns, and that by exposing him publicly, I'd protected future victims he couldn't target anymore. I was leaving therapy when Margaret called, me crying so hard I could barely understand her words until she managed to tell me Julian had broken into their house while they were visiting her sister and stolen jewelry, electronics, and worst of all, had destroyed every single family photo in the house, including baby pictures and wedding albums. The detective. V called me an hour later because Margaret's security system had caught clear footage of the break-in, and Julian wasn't alone because Nina was right there with him carrying garbage bags full of stolen items, which meant they were now both wanted for burglary, and my case got upgraded to high priority. My building's security guard stopped me in the lobby 3 days later to show me their system logs with multiple attempts to access my floor, using an old key fob at 3 in the morning for 3 nights straight, which meant Julian was getting desperate enough to try breaking into my place. I couldn't keep sleeping on Becca's couch forever, so I used part of my promotion raise to start looking for a new apartment in a building with better security and doormen, and when the realtor asked why I was moving, I just said I needed a fresh start. Months after the wedding, Mia threw me what she called a divorce party, even though Julian and I never technically got married, and everyone wore black while we ate a chocolate cake that said "dodged a bullet" in bright red frosting, which felt like the kind of closure I needed to start moving forward. 2 weeks later at 2 a.m., my phone started ringing from an unknown number, and when I picked it up, there was heavy breathing before Julian's voice came through the line. "You think you won?" he said, and I could hear the rage in every word. "I'm going to destroy everything you love." And my hands were shaking as I hit the record button on my other phone and captured every threat he made before he hung up. I immediately forwarded the recording to the detective who'd been handling my case, and he called me back within minutes to say they were tracing the call. The next morning, my parents called me in complete panic because someone had thrown a brick through their living room window with a note wrapped around it. The note said, "Your daughter is next," in Julian's handwriting, and my parents live 3 states away in Iowa, which meant he was expanding his reach. My dad was trying to stay calm, but I could hear my mom crying in the background as they described finding glass all over their carpet. The local police took the brick and note as evidence and said they'd increase patrols past my parents' house, but we all knew that wasn't enough. Within hours, the FBI got involved because the threats had crossed state lines, and an agent named Smith called to explain the situation. He told me Julian was escalating and they were upgrading this to federal charges, which finally felt like someone was taking this seriously. Agent Smith assigned me a case number and gave me his direct line to call if anything else happened. I spent the next 3 days looking for a new apartment with security features, and found one downtown with 24/7 guards and key fobs for every floor. I only told Becca and my parents the address, and made them promise not to share it with anyone else no matter what. The building manager showed me all the security cameras, and explained how no one could get past the lobby without being on the approved visitor list. That first night in the new place, I actually slept through the whole night without waking up every hour to check the locks. About 14 weeks after the wedding, Nina's mother called me out of nowhere and her voice sounded broken. She told me Nina had lost everything, including her job and all her friends, and now Julian had abandoned her too. "She needs help," she said, but I just gave her my therapist's number and hung up. I felt bad for Nina's mom, but I couldn't let myself care about Nina after everything she'd done to me. A week later, Agent Smith called to say they'd tracked Julian to a motel outside Chicago using his credit card. He'd been using stolen cards and fake IDs to move around, but made the mistake of using his real card at a gas station. The FBI team got to the motel just 3 hours after he'd checked out and found evidence he'd been planning something bigger. They found maps of my neighborhood and photos of my new building that he must have taken from across the street. My new apartment's security called me the next morning saying someone claiming to be a delivery driver had tried to get my unit number. The description matched Julian perfectly, and the security footage showed him arguing with the guard before leaving. Despite all my precautions, he'd found me, and I knew I couldn't keep living in fear like this. I hired a bodyguard for the next month, even though it felt extreme, but I kept thinking about what Emma had told me. She'd said by the end she was afraid for her life, and I wasn't going to become another statistic. The bodyguard was this huge guy named Marcus, who used to work for celebrities, and he started following me everywhere. At work, I threw myself into the product launch we'd been planning for months and tried to act normal. My team didn't know about Marcus sitting in reception pretending to read magazines while watching everyone who came through the door. I was determined not to let Julian take my career along with everything else he'd already stolen from me. The launch presentation went perfectly, and my boss even mentioned a possible promotion, which felt like the first good news in months. 4 months after the wedding, Tara came to my apartment with champagne and the biggest smile on her face. Her boyfriend had proposed the night before at the restaurant where they'd had their first date, and she was glowing with happiness. "Would you be my maid of honor?" she asked carefully, like she was afraid I'd say no. I said yes immediately, because I wasn't going to let Julian steal my ability to celebrate love and friendship. Tara hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and we spent the rest of the night looking at wedding venues on her laptop. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was making breakfast, and the detective's voice was different, almost excited. Nina had walked into the police station at 6 in the morning and turned herself in, shaking so bad they had to get her a blanket and some hot coffee before she could even talk. She wanted to make a deal and testify against Julian for everything she knew in exchange for reduced charges, and the detective said she looked like she hadn't slept in days. During her deposition 2 weeks later, Nina broke down crying and told them about a storage unit Julian had rented under a fake name 6 months before we even got engaged. The FBI agents found it within hours, and what they discovered made everyone in the room go silent. There were hundreds of photos of me taken without my knowledge, printed out and organized by date in plastic folders. Pictures of me at the grocery store, at the gym, walking to my car after work, even through my apartment window before I got blackout curtains. He had my daily routines mapped out on a whiteboard with times and locations, floor plans of my old apartment he must have drawn from memory, and notes about my habits written in tiny handwriting. The worst part was finding 3 more folders with different women's names on them, all from before he met me, all with the same creepy documentation. The FBI agent handling the case told me I was the first one who fought back publicly and actually exposed him. That night I couldn't sleep, just kept thinking about all those photos and wondering if our whole relationship was just another con from the start. Every sweet moment we had felt poisoned now, like maybe he was just studying me the whole time, learning what buttons to push. 5 months after the wedding, that never happened. A FedEx package arrived from Margaret with a check for $50,000 and a note that said she wanted me to use it to build the life I deserved. I spent some on therapy twice a week, and the rest on security cameras, new locks, and a really good alarm system for my new apartment. The FBI called me a month later saying a motel owner in Texas had reported someone trying to use a stolen credit card, and the description matched Julian perfectly. By the time agents got there, he was gone, but they found hair dye in the trash and receipts showing he'd been moving north toward Oklahoma. I was walking to my car after work when I saw him standing by the concrete pillar in the parking garage, looking thinner and desperate with dark circles under his eyes. My bodyguard immediately stepped between us while Julian started begging me to just listen to him for 5 minutes. He kept saying we were perfect together, and I'd ruined everything by making such a big scene at the wedding, his voice getting louder and more frantic. I backed away while dialing 911 and told him he was perfect at pretending, but that was all he'd ever been. The police showed up in less than 3 minutes with lights flashing and guns drawn because they knew about all his warrants. They arrested him right there on the concrete while he kept screaming that this wasn't over, that I'd regret this, that we belonged together. 6 months after the wedding, I sat in the courtroom watching Julian plead not guilty to 47 charges, including identity theft, fraud, stalking, and making threats across state lines. His public defender looked like he wanted to be anywhere else as he flipped through the massive case file that kept growing every week. The judge took one look at Julian's history of running and denied bail immediately, ordering him held until trial. The months crawled by with pretrial motions and discovery, while Julian sat in county jail getting paler and skinnier. I spent those 11 months rebuilding my life piece by piece. I moved to a new apartment across town where nobody knew my story. I started therapy twice a week to deal with the betrayal. I threw myself into work and got promoted to senior analyst. The trial date finally arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in November. I walked into the courthouse wearing the navy suit Margaret had bought me for good luck. The courtroom was packed with everyone from the wedding plus reporters who'd been following the case. Julian shuffled in wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles that clanked with every step. He'd lost at least 30 pounds, and his hair had gone gray at the temples. Nina sat in the witness area looking like she hadn't slept in months. Her designer clothes hung loose on her frame and her hands shook constantly. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically with evidence I'd never even seen. Bank statements showing Julian had opened 14 credit cards in my name. Screenshots of him selling my grandmother's jewelry online while I was at work. Security footage of him breaking into my apartment after I'd changed the locks. Phone records proving he'd been stalking 3 other women while we were engaged. During the first recess, Margaret pulled me into a fierce hug in the hallway. She whispered that I was the daughter she'd always wanted, and that she was proud of me. Her eyes were wet when she pulled back, but she squeezed my shoulders and nodded toward the courtroom. Nina took the stand on day 2, and the whole room went silent. She admitted to the affair, but then described how Julian had slowly cut her off from other friends. How he'd convinced her that I was jealous and controlling. How he'd threatened to show everyone private photos if she tried to end things. The prosecutor showed text after text of Julian manipulating and threatening her. By the time Nina stepped down, half the jury was glaring at Julian with open disgust. The defense tried calling character witnesses, but could only find 3 people willing to testify. Julian's old college roommate mumbled something about him being fun at parties. A coworker said he seemed normal at the office. His cousin claimed he'd always been misunderstood. When they asked Julian's father to testify, he stood up and walked out of the courtroom without a word. Julian fired his lawyer that night and insisted on testifying himself the next morning. He strutted to the witness stand like he was accepting an award. He claimed everything was consensual and that I was just bitter about being rejected. He said Nina had pursued him and that I was too controlling to satisfy him. He painted himself as the victim of two crazy women trying to ruin his life. The prosecutor destroyed him in less than 20 minutes. She showed emails where he'd bragged to friends about conning me. She presented recordings of him laughing about how stupid I was to trust him. She had receipts showing he'd been planning to empty our accounts and disappear after the honeymoon. Julian's face got redder with each piece of evidence until he finally exploded. He screamed that I'd destroyed his life over nothing, and that any man would want someone on the side. The judge had to bang her gavel 3 times to restore order while the jury stared at him in shock. The prosecutor saved the worst for last on day 4. She showed Julian's laptop history with searches for how to forge documents and steal identities. She had proof he'd done this to 2 previous girlfriends who were too scared to press charges. She presented evidence that he'd already bought a plane ticket to Thailand for the day after our wedding. The entire wedding had been one giant con to clean out my accounts and run. That night, I couldn't force down more than a few bites of soup. My roommate held me while I sobbed for the woman I used to be, the one who believed in fairy tales and happy endings and true love. The jury only needed 3 hours the next morning. We filed back into the courtroom and Julian sat there smirking like he'd already won. The foreman stood up and cleared his throat before reading guilty on all 47 counts. Julian's smirk vanished and his mouth fell open as the guilty verdicts kept coming. Identity theft? Guilty. Fraud? Guilty. Stalking? Guilty. Breaking and entering? Guilty. Interstate threats? Guilty. The list went on for 5 full minutes while Julian's face went from red to white to gray. Margaret nodded with grim satisfaction from the gallery, while his brother actually applauded. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following week and revoked bail completely. Julian had to be dragged out screaming that this wasn't over and that I'd pay for this. A week later, we all gathered again for sentencing. The judge looked down at Julian with pure contempt on her face. She called him a predator who targeted vulnerable women and destroyed their lives for sport. She said society needed protection from people like him. Then she sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for 5 years. Julian collapsed in his chair while his lawyer just shook his head. As they led him away in chains, he turned to look at me one last time. I stared right back until he disappeared through the door to begin his new life in prison. The court officers gripped Julian's arms tighter as they turned him toward the holding area, but he twisted his whole body around to stare at me with eyes that had gone completely feral. His face contorted into something I'd never seen before, pure hatred radiating from every muscle as his lips pulled back from his teeth like an animal. I kept my chin up and my shoulders straight, watching him struggle against the officer's grip while his expensive suit wrinkled and bunched around the handcuffs. The heavy door slammed shut behind him with a metallic clang that echoed through the courtroom, and I finally let out the breath I'd been holding for what felt like hours. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed toward me with cameras and microphones, their questions overlapping into a wall of noise about justice and revenge and healing. I stopped on the courthouse steps and waited for them to quiet down before speaking clearly into the nearest microphone about how I hoped other victims would find courage to come forward and that shame belonged only to the perpetrators. 2 weeks later, I sat in the back row of a different courtroom, watching Nina accept her plea deal for 2 years probation and 300 hours of community service at a women's shelter. She looked smaller than I remembered, her designer clothes replaced with a simple black dress, her perfect makeup gone, dark circles under her eyes telling the story of sleepless nights. The judge lectured her about breach of trust and the sacred bonds of friendship, while she kept her head down and nodded at all the right moments. A letter arrived at my apartment the next day with her handwriting on the envelope, but I dropped it straight into my filing cabinet without opening it, knowing I wasn't ready for whatever apology or excuse she'd written. Margaret called that weekend to invite me to a celebration dinner at her house, insisting that Julian's choices didn't change the fact that she considered me family. I drove to her beautiful colonial home where she'd set the dining room table with her best china and cooked all my favorite dishes from the engagement parties we'd planned together. But she hugged me at the door and held on longer than usual, whispering that her son's crimes didn't erase the love she had for the woman who should have been her daughter-in-law. Her grace in handling her son's conviction amazed me as she served dinner and talked about everything except Julian, filling the silence with stories about her garden and her book club. A month after the verdict, I found myself back in my therapist's office, this time trying to process the aftermath of the trial rather than prepare for it. I told her I didn't feel the victory everyone said I should feel, just this bone-deep exhaustion that made getting out of bed feel like climbing a mountain. She nodded and explained that I'd been in survival mode for over a year, running on adrenaline and rage, and now my body was finally letting itself feel the weight of everything. The healing wasn't going to be linear, she said, and some days would be harder than others, but I was already stronger than I knew. A card arrived in my mailbox with no return address, but I recognized Emma's handwriting immediately when I opened it to find a photo of her wedding day. She'd written that my courage in the courtroom had given her strength to trust again, to believe that not all men were predators, and she'd married a wonderful man who treated her with the respect she deserved. I taped the photo to my refrigerator next to the other cards from women who'd reached out after seeing the trial coverage. each one a reminder that my pain had helped others find their voices. David and I were having a quiet dinner at my apartment 6 months later, just pasta and wine on my coffee table while we watched a movie, when he suddenly paused the TV and turned to face me. He pulled out a small velvet box and said he knew marriage might be scary after everything I'd been through, but he promised to earn my trust every single day for the rest of our lives. The ring was simple, just a single diamond on a gold band, nothing like the elaborate setting Julian had picked to show off rather than show love. I surprised myself by saying yes immediately. No hesitation, no fear, just this warm certainty that this man had proven himself through every moment of the trial. 14 months after that disaster of a wedding, I stood in my new apartment looking around at the life I'd built from the ashes of my old one. My new job at a nonprofit legal aid society paid less than my corporate position, but gave me purpose, helping other women navigate the court system after abuse. David had moved in 3 months ago, and our place felt like a real home with his books mixed with mine on the shelves, and his coffee mug next to mine in the kitchen. The friends who'd stood by me through everything came over for dinner regularly, and Margaret still called every Sunday to check in. Becca brought wine to my place for our monthly catch-up, and we spread photos from the past year across my dining room table, laughing at shots from her birthday party and David's promotion celebration. She picked up a photo from the trial's last day, both of us walking out of the courthouse, and asked what the best revenge really was after everything that happened. I thought about it while looking at all the photos of my new life, and told her it was simple, just living well without him, being happy in ways he'd never understand. The final photo she pulled out was an invitation to Tara's wedding where I'd be maid of honor, and we started planning my speech about resilience and friendship. 3 months later, I stood at the altar next to Tara in a lavender bridesmaid dress, looking out at the crowd gathered to celebrate real love between two people who actually respected each other. My speech talked about the courage it takes to trust someone with your heart after you've seen how badly people can hurt each other, how friendship can survive even the worst betrayals if it's built on truth. David smiled at me from his seat in the third row, while Margaret wiped tears from her eyes in the back. And I realized I wasn't the same woman who'd discovered those Instagram messages 2 years ago. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who knew her worth, someone who'd learned that the best revenge wasn't destruction, but transformation. I raised my champagne glass to toast Tara and her new husband, feeling genuinely happy for the first time since before I'd found those messages, finally free from the shadow of what Julian and Nina had done to me.